Beckett Doyle had learned to fear silence more than gunfire, out here in Red Butte Basin. When the wind stopped whispering through the red cliffs and the desert night went still, something was always coming. And on that late November evening, the silence was so sharp it felt like the land was holding its breath. That was when he saw them, two figures collapsed against his fence line, half hidden in the dying light. The older woman knelt rigid, one hand on a blade, the other bracing her sister whose skin had gone pale from blood loss. Apache, exhausted, close to freezing in the merciless dry cold that fell into the basin after sundown. Beck stood there, clutching the only blanket he owned, the last thing his wife ever touched. He knew stepping forward could end in his death, but leaving them there would make him the kind of man he'd hated all his life. "Don't move. Cowboy," the older woman warned, her voice shaking with both strength and desperation. And with that single sentence, the night shifted because nothing about this encounter would end quietly. Before we continue, please take a moment to support the channel. A simple like, a quick comment, or hitting that subscribe button helps these Wild West tales reach more people who love them. Let me know where you're listening from, and thank you for riding along with us. Night settled over Red Butte Basin, the way a lid settles over a dying fire, slow, heavy, and absolute. The red cliffs, towering on three sides, trapped the cold the moment the sun slipped away. No snow ever touched this land, but the air sharpened into something that scraped the lungs with every breath. Sagebrush rustled like brittle paper, and the earth, cracked from months of dry wind, held no warmth at all. It was the kind of cold that hollowed a man out from the inside. This was the place Beckett Doyle had chosen to disappear. 3 years earlier, he'd lost a home, a wife, a little girl with a laugh brighter than morning light. Since then, solitude had clung to him like dust. He worked his horses, tended his fences, hunted just enough to live. He carried a quietness that made strangers keep their distance, a quietness with weight, not peace. The only things he'd kept from his old life were a frayed coat, a pale scar on his forearm, and a single blanket stitched by his wife during their last winter together. Even now, standing a few yards from the two fallen women, Beck felt the old ache stir beneath his ribs. He studied them in the dimming glow. The older one strong, sinewed, her posture fierce despite exhaustion, had a presence that cut through the cold. She held herself like someone who'd fought for every mile she'd traveled. Her eyes, dark as volcanic glass, never blinked as she watched him. That gaze wasn't just wary, it was carved from years of surviving what others didn't. Her sister, Selah, lay slumped against the fence, her breathing shallow and unsteady. Coyotes hadn't found them. The night might. Beck noticed the trembling in her fingers, the way her lips had begun to pale. She wasn't built for this kind of cold, not with a wound draining the heat from her body. The faint smell of old blood mixed with dust reached him on the wind. He lifted the lantern higher, letting its glow wash over them. For a moment, he saw something flash across the older woman's face, not weakness, not fear, but a desperation so tightly held it looked like defiance. She pressed her palm against Selah's shoulder in a gesture both protective and tender, a gesture of someone who had never left her sister behind. Beck recognized that instinct. It tightened something in him. The story behind these two women remained hidden, but their condition spoke enough. Clothes travel-worn, no horses, skin wind-chapped. Apache travelers rarely moved without purpose, Yet here they were, stranded, exposed, too far from any settlement to be safe. Beck shifted his weight, feeling the crunch of dry soil beneath his boots. The desert carried a stillness that made every breath loud, every heartbeat unmistakable. He wondered how long the sisters had been out here, long enough for the basin to turn them into silhouettes of survival, long enough that he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen them. And as the lantern's flame flickered in the cold air, he realized something else. Fate had pushed them onto his land, onto his silence, and whether he wanted it or not, their story had just crossed into his. Beckett lowered the lantern first. He'd learned long ago that a man who approached with too much light looked like a threat. But even with the glow dimmed, he could still see the tension tightening the older woman's shoulders. Her blade caught the faint amber light, trembling only when the desert wind cut across her knuckles. "I said, don't move," she warned again, voice roughened by cold and hours of holding herself together. Beck kept his hands where she could see them. "Your sister won't last the night out here. That's not for you to decide. She's already slipping," he said quietly. The woman didn't answer, but her jaw twitched. She shifted, adjusting her stance so she could shield Selah more completely. Selah's breath rattled softly, fragile as dry leaves on stone. Her skin had taken on a bluish cast under the lantern's faint glow. Beck set the lantern down gently, letting the sound of glass against earth break the silence just enough to show he meant no harm. "What's your name?" he asked. "You don't get my name. Fair enough. But you get a choice." He lifted the blanket, letting her see the worn edges, the hand-stitched seams. "It's warm inside. I can treat that wound. Or at least stop it from killing her tonight." Naira's eyes flicked to the blanket. Recognition crossed her features, not of the object itself, but the sacrifice it represented. A man alone in a basin like this didn't have spare anything. "What's in your cabin?" she demanded. "A fire," Beck answered. "Clean water, bandages, nothing more, and weapons, one rifle, and I left it inside for you to see." The wind picked up again, sweeping dust around their feet. Selah let out a small sound, not quite a groan, not quite a breath, and slumped further. Naira dropped to her knees beside her, panic breaking through the controlled mask on her face. She pressed her hand to Selah's cheek, whispering something in Apache Beck couldn't understand. When she looked up again, her eyes were darker, sharper, split between fear and fury. "If you touch her wrong, you'll kill me," Beck finished. "I know." Their gazes locked, the standoff stretched thin as rawhide. Somewhere far off, the basin answered with a hollow echo, a single drumbeat swallowed by distance. Naira's pupils narrowed. She'd heard it too. That sound was not wind, not horses. Something else. Something closing in. Beck took a slow breath. "You're not alone out here, are you?" Her grip tightened on the blade. "Inside, now, and you walk first." It wasn't the words that struck him, it was the way she said them. Not as a surrender, but as a command issued by someone who had led others before. Beck nodded, stepped backward, and turned toward the cabin. He left the door wide open, keeping his movement slow, deliberate, every inch of his back prickling under the weight of her stare. Inside. The fire he left smoldering cast a warm, flickering glow across the walls. Beck stayed near the stove, showing the breadth of open space between them. Behind him, he heard Naira struggle to lift her sister, then the soft dragging of feet across the threshold. Selah's breathing quickened as the heat reached her. Naira guided her to the far wall, positioning themselves so the door and Beck were always in sight. Beck didn't speak, didn't approach. He only nodded toward the pot of warming water and the folded cloth on the table. For the wound, he said. You can use them yourself if you prefer. For the first time since he'd seen her. Naira hesitated. Her hand hovered over the cloth. The firelight revealed the exhaustion pulling at her face. The trembling in her fingers she tried hard to hide. She finally asked, barely above a whisper, "Why are you doing this?" Beck looked at Selah, then back at her. Because out here, someone has to. The basin outside went silent again, as if the land itself were listening. And inside that cabin, under the weight of cold, fear, and something unspoken, the first fragile thread between them began to form. The fire in Beckett's cabin grew steadier, warming the cramped space with a glow that softened the sharp edges of the night. Outside, the basin lay in a hush so deep it felt as if the world had paused. But inside, 3 breaths uneven, guarded, fragile wove a different kind of stillness. Selah lay wrapped in Beck's only blanket, her face pale but no longer gray. Every so often, a tremor ran through her body, and Naira would tighten her hold, murmuring in Apache, grounding her back to life. Beck knelt a distance away, rinsing the blood from his hands in a basin of warm water, letting the steam rise and fade into the cold air drifting through the open doorway. "You should close that door," Naira said quietly, without looking at him. "You came because it was open," Beck replied. She didn't argue. She simply adjusted Selah's head against her thigh. The motion practiced and gentle. There was a steadiness in the way she touched her sister, a fierceness worn into tenderness. Beck found himself watching, not out of curiosity, but because it had been a long time since he'd seen anyone care for another with that much devotion. "You're freezing," Naira said after a moment, her gaze finally lifting to him. "Your lips, they're turning blue. I'll manage, not if you pass out before I do." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. He pushed the door halfway closed, letting only a slit of cold air breeze through. For someone who claimed not to trust him, she had just given him permission to seal them all into the same room. When he returned to the fire, Beck reached slowly for the cloths. "The wound's infected. If I don't clean it again, fever will take her." Naira stiffened. "Show me." He knelt beside her but didn't reach for Selah. Instead, he dipped the cloth into the warm water and set it between them. "You can do it. I'll tell you how." She studied his hands, as if searching for deceit. But what she saw was something else, something worn down by grief, something steady, because it had been broken too many times to shatter again. After a long silence, she exhaled. "No," she said. "You do it. I need both hands to hold her." The admission was soft, vulnerable. Beck nodded, then moved slowly, letting her see every motion when he pressed the damp cloth to Selah's wound. The younger woman cried out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers dug in, trembling. Beck held steady, murmuring, "Easy, stay with me." Whether she understood or not, Selah's breathing steadied enough for him to work. Naira watched him in a way she hadn't before. There was no suspicion now, only a guarded astonishment. Beck could feel her gaze on him, could feel the weight of being seen not as a threat, but as a man trying. "You've done this before," she said quietly. He didn't answer at first. His hands continued their work with a gentleness that betrayed a history he rarely let surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "My wife, she got sick one winter. I tried everything." He didn't look up. Nothing worked. Silence swelled between them, not empty, but aching. Naira lowered her eyes, the hardness in them shifting into something more human. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Beck tied the last strip of cloth, then sat back, rubbing his chilled hands together. You don't have to be. I'm not sorry because it's a wound you still carry, she said. I'm sorry because, out here, good people die too often. She hesitated before adding, and too often because others looked away. The words hit Beck with quiet force. She didn't know his story. Not really. But somehow she touched the center of it. A gust of cold air pressed against the cabin walls. In the distance, something faint, almost like a heartbeat, thudded once and vanished. Naira's head snapped toward the door. That sound again, she whispered. Drums, Beck asked. Naira didn't answer immediately. Her fingers found Selah's hair, smoothing it back with trembling care. If it is, she murmured, they're closer tonight. Beck looked at her. Your people, and yours, she said, locking eyes with him. At dawn, they'll decide what you are. Her gaze lingered a heartbeat too long before drifting back to her sister. Beck let the words settle, feeling their weight, but for the first time since he'd found the sisters on his land. The cold inside the cabin wasn't quite as sharp. Something in the room had shifted, something fragile, something dangerous, and neither of them dared name it yet. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. The fire burned low, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Selah drifted in and out of fevered sleep, sometimes gripping Beck's hand like a lifeline, sometimes whispering words neither of them could understand. Naira never loosened her hold on her sister, but exhaustion was beginning to etch itself into her features. Beck felt the shift before he heard it, the basin tightening, as if the land itself was preparing for something. A cold gust swept through the half-open door, snuffing the edge of the fire. The silence that followed was too deep, too exact. Beck set down the cup he'd been warming and reached for the lantern. Naira's head lifted sharply. Did you hear that? Before Beck could answer, a flicker moved past the doorway. A shadow, then the soft thud of feet. Not hoofbeats, not coyotes. Human. Naira's hand flew to her knife. Beck raised a finger, signaling her to stay still. He stepped quietly, deliberately, toward the door. The moment he reached it, a body slammed against the wooden frame. Cale burst inside like a storm wind young, furious, his eyes blazing. His blade flashed through the lamplight, aimed straight at Beck's throat. You took them, Cale snarled. You bleed tonight for it. Beck staggered back, the knife grazing his collarbone. Naira shot to her feet, knife already drawn. Kaylee, stop, she shouted in Apache, her voice cracking under strain. But Kaylee was too far gone, rage boiling over. He lunged again, and this time Beck grabbed his wrist, slamming him against the cabin wall. They grappled, boots grinding over the wooden floor. Kaylee was wiry and fast, fueled by fury and panic. Beck was stronger, but he hadn't fought another man in years, not like this. You dare touch her! Kaylee roared, breaking free and driving toward Beck's ribs. Enough! Naira's voice tore through the cabin like a whip crack. She wedged herself between them, one hand flat against Cale's chest, the other raised toward Beck in warning. Her breathing was fast, her eyes burning not with fear, but with fury at both men. Look at her, she hissed, pointing at Selah curled in the blanket. Does she look harmed? Does she look chained? He kept her alive. Keely's rage shifted, faltering as he glanced at her sister. The sight of Selah's shallow breaths, the soft tremor of her fingers, knocked something loose inside him. His blade lowered an inch, but no more. They will not believe this, he said through clenched teeth. Not my father, not the warriors. Dawn will come, And they will see Apache women in a white man's home. They will see what they've seen too many times. Naira's voice softened, but only slightly. Then let morning show the truth. She turned back to Beck. Were you hurt? Beck wiped the smear of blood at his collarbone. I've had worse. The faintest flicker crossed Naira's face, a mixture of annoyance and something dangerously close to concern. She sheathed her knife and guided Keel toward the door. Go, she said. Tell the others she is alive. Tell them we are safe till dawn. Keel hesitated, his glare burning into Beck with a promise that this wasn't over. Then he vanished into the dark basin, swallowed by the cold night. The cabin settled again, but not back into calm, into the tense breath before battle kind of stillness. Naira closed the door fully for the first time, shutting out the night. You should have let him kill me, Beck murmured as he sat by the fire. What makes you think he would have stopped there? She replied. He didn't have an answer, and she didn't need one outside. The first drumbeat struck. It wasn't faint this time. It wasn't distant. It rolled through the valley like thunder trapped between stone walls. The fire trembled. The floorboards vibrated beneath them. Selah stirred, startled, curling toward the warmth. Your people, Beck whispered. Naira nodded slowly, closer than we thought. She rose, walked to the window slit, and peered into the dark. The world beyond glowed with faint lantern light. Shapes moved, hundreds of them, cutting silhouettes against the cliffs. They've surrounded the basin, Beck said. Naira's profile looked carved from the same stone as the cliffs. 300 warriors. My father does not travel lightly. Will they attack? If they believe you touched us? Yes. Beck felt something in his chest tighten. The weight of old guilt. The echo of flames from a different night. A different house. I'm not running. Naira turned to him sharply. If you stay, you die. And if I run, he said. Meeting her eyes, Selah dies. And you do too. Naira inhaled slowly, as if the truth of it stung her. She stepped closer, the fire haloing her in shifting gold. You don't know my father, she whispered. Maybe not. Beck's voice was quiet but steady. But I know what it feels like to come home too late. I won't be that man again. The drums grew louder, closer, until each beat rattled the stovepipe. Selah whimpered at the noise, and Naira knelt to soothe her, brushing hair from her face in soft, rhythmic strokes. When she looked up again, the fear she had kept buried all night finally shone through. Beckett Doyle, she said softly, dawn will test more than your truth. It will test whether your heart can stand in front of my father's judgment. He swallowed. And yours, Naira, didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was heavier than the night, more dangerous than the drums. Outside, the basin lit with torches. Warriors lined the ridges, their silhouettes shifting like predators waiting for a cue. Inside, with Selah breathing unevenly between them. Beck and Naira shared a moment suspended on the edge between fate and choice, a moment that carried the weight of two worlds about to collide. And then the drums stopped, not faded, stopped. The kind of stop that meant only one thing. Dawn had arrived. The first rays of dawn spilled into Red Butte Basin, turning the cliffs into towering slabs of firelit stone. 300 Apache warriors stood in disciplined silence, their torches extinguished, but their presence blazing across the valley. The air was sharp and dry, each breath a thin trail of vapor vanishing almost instantly. In the heart of that vast circle, Beckett stood unarmed beside his cabin. Naira and Selah, wrapped in Beck's lone blanket, flanked him. When Anacona dismounted and approached, the basin seemed to hold still, as if the land itself were listening. What followed was judgment fierce, ancient, and binding. Beck spoke honestly. Naira defended him with a voice steadier than the hands clutching the blanket. Selah whispered a few words of her own, small but powerful. And when all was said, Anacona read the truth not only from their words, but from the details, the cooled bandages, the open door. The fire burned long through the night, the absence of tied hands or bruises of restraint, the blood-stained cloth torn from Beck's own shirt. When Anacona placed the family stone necklace on Beck's chest, the warriors behind him let out a low murmur of recognition. The gesture meant protection, brotherhood, a bond not easily severed. Kale lowered his blade in reluctant acceptance. Selah leaned faintly against Naira, exhausted but alive. The tension that had held the basin taut all night finally eased, dissolving into the crisp morning air. Hours later, when the warriors had dispersed across the valley, some hunting, some resting, some keeping watch at a respectful distance, Naira and Selah returned to Beck's cabin, this time by their own choosing. The silence between them was different now, not heavy with suspicion, but with something unspoken and new. Beck knelt near the stove, coaxing a flame from the last of his dry kindling. Selah sat on a folded blanket, breathing easier, color returning to her cheeks. Naira stood at the doorway, letting the morning wind brush across her face. She looked both weary and unbreakable. "You should rest," Beck said without looking up. "I will," she answered, "when I don't feel like the ground might vanish beneath me." He glanced over his shoulder. "It's over. For you." "Maybe," she said. "Not for us." He rose slowly. "You're safe here." Naira's lips parted, her expression flickering between gratitude and resistance. "I don't understand you," she murmured. "A stranger on our land, alone, carrying grief in your eyes. Why help us? Why risk your life when you could have walked away?" Beck hesitated. The truth sat heavy on his tongue. "Because once, people heard screams from my home. They didn't come. Fear kept them away. I swore I'd never be that man. Not again." Naira's breath caught, so soft he almost didn't hear it. She stepped closer, the firelight catching the warmth in her eyes. "And now, you bear the weight of a promise no one saw. Except you," he said quietly. A long silence stretched between them. Selah watched them with a knowing softness, her head resting against the log wall. The morning light slipped across the floorboards and climbed Naira's legs, brightening the edges of her form. She didn't move away when Beck shifted nearer. "You stood before my father," she said, "and did not tremble." "I was terrified," Beck admitted, "just not of him." Her brows lowered. "Then of what?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Something in his silence made her pulse stumble and her gaze soften ever so slightly, before the moment drifted too close to something fragile. Selah spoke. "My sister was right," she whispered, her voice thin but sincere. "If you ran, we would have died." Naira knelt beside Selah, smoothing her hair with a gentle hand. "We live because he stayed," she said quietly. "But now we have to return his kindness." She reached into a leather satchel propped by the door and withdrew a thick woven blanket patterns of earth and ember woven into its fiber. She held it out to Beck. "For the one you gave," she said, "may this keep the cold from claiming you again." He accepted it with both hands, unable to mask the way his throat tightened. "Thank you." Naira's expression softened at his reaction. "There is more. My father expects your presence at our next gathering." But this, she paused, then met his gaze without flinching. This invitation is mine. If you come, stand near the fire, where we can see you. The words carried weight beyond their sound. Beck felt it. Selah felt it. And from the way Naira held his gaze, she felt it most of all. Outside, the basin basked in pale sunlight. Inside, for the first time in years, Beck felt something warm settle beneath his ribs, something that wasn't memory, or grief, or the ache of solitude. It was possibility. Red Butte Basin glowed differently that afternoon. The sun dipped low behind the cliffs, staining the world in hues of ember and rust, as if the land itself remembered the drums of dawn and now exhaled in relief. Beckett stood on the porch of his small cabin, the woven blanket Naira had given him draped over one shoulder. The wind that had once felt like a blade now brushed past him like a familiar hand. The basin had always echoed with loneliness. Today, it echoed with the quiet footsteps of warriors moving through the ridges, the soft calls of women gathering water, and the faint laughter of Apache children playing somewhere beyond sight. This land, which once swallowed his grief whole, now seemed to breathe with the pulse of lives he had been too long apart from. He touched the carved stone Onakona had placed around his neck. Warm now, shaped by his skin, a symbol not given lightly, a promise that he no longer walked this harsh country as a ghost. Naira and Selah mounted their horses at the edge of his clearing. Selah's posture was steadier, her eyes brighter. Naira looked back at him over her shoulder, her expression both firm and unexpectedly gentle. 2 weeks, she said. Follow the ridge north. You'll see the fires. Beck nodded. I'll come. He didn't know if she'd believed him until the faintest curve touched the corner of her mouth, an expression quick as a heartbeat, small enough to miss if he hadn't been searching for it. Then they rode away, their silhouettes blending into the copper horizon. The wind carried the sound of their horses' hooves, soft and rhythmic, until even that faded. Beck turned back toward his cabin. In front of the door, placed with deliberate care, stood a single arrow wrapped at the shaft with a strip of white deer hide, a mark of protection, a reminder that eyes watched over him now not to judge, but to guard. He bent, lifted the arrow, and set it beside the doorframe. As he stepped inside, the fire he'd built earlier rose with a gentle crackle, its glow touching the new blanket and the old scars alike. For the first time in 3 years, Beckett Doyle did not feel like a man surviving another day in the wild. He felt like a man being welcomed home.